Bliss and Grit is an entirely listener-supported show. Supporting us is also designed to support you through keeping the episodes rolling, but also through rewards for your donation, like a Getting Started guide, a private forum, and downloadable meditations. To become a supporting member, you can visit patreon.com/Bliss and Grit. Hello, beautifuls. You're listening to Bliss and Grit. I'm Brooke Thomas, and I'll be joined soon by my dear friend and co-host, Vanessa Scotto. On the show, we're having conversations about the awakening spiritual path and what does that even mean? What is a real evolution of our lives? How do we ultimately embrace everything, the beauty and the crazy, the joys and the messes, the bliss and the grit that is a human life? Thank you for being here as a listener. We hugely appreciate it. If you want to stay up to date on all things Bliss and Grit and get a weekly digest of the resources that we are currently loving, you can go to blissandgrit.com to subscribe. And if you're wanting more in-depth support as you navigate your own path and internal process, we both see clients privately. So feel free to go to the website for more information on that as well. The last thing before we head into the conversation, we do sometimes curse. So if you are in non-swearing company, you may want to wear headphones. Okay, here we go.
Hello, Brooke.
Hello, Vanessa.
And hello, all of you listening. Oh, today's going to be an interesting conversation. We're back after a 2-week technical hiatus. Yes, tech break. And oh my gosh, for all of you who might be untech savvy like us and yet running an at-home podcast, you might understand how difficult that could be for us too. Mm-hmm. So today is interesting because we're going to share a little bit about a personal topic, in this case, about Bliss and Grit, and a little bit of the meta process, what's going on behind the scenes and the changes that's going to bring and how that may impact all of you. But also, of course, a larger conversation about change and what happens when you change something you love. You know, too often we're aware of change that comes because it either arrives in our lap, you know, something in our external reality changes, or change that's driven because something hurts and we kind of fight to change it. But for so many of us on this healing and awakening journey, we're afraid that change will come to things we love. Mm-hmm. We're afraid that change will come in this unknown and unpredictable way, and we'll lose something or someone, you know, so often. So we're going to talk a little bit about our personal meta process and use that as a talking point for this larger conversation on how do we meet and navigate change and transformation when something is shifting that we love or we valued or appreciated.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Right on, right on.
Should I just keep on going?
Well, I mean, I guess we'll say what the change is to Bliss and Grit. So from a practical, tangible point of view, what it means is that our episodes are going to be less frequent.
At the speed of inspiration.
At the speed of inspiration is our motto. So up until now, we've taken chunks of time off in the summer and then every once in a while, you know, over like winter holidays or things here and there. But pretty much we've put out a weekly podcast for 3 years.
For 3 years, over 3 years. Kind of amazing.
Yeah, totally amazing. And it's delightful. You know, like it's been delightful on all fronts. It is what I hoped it could be, which is that, you know, you and I would get, because we're long distance, for those who don't know, I'm in Connecticut, Vanessa's in Austin, Texas, that we would get time from a selfish point of view to like hang out and have the conversations we're always having when we're in person. And what we noticed about our conversations that we had as friends, just because, you know, we've both been in the healing and transformation fields, but also on our own paths for decades, was like, you know what? We could have these conversations in public as much as that is possible, right? That there's always some awareness of the audience when we're talking to each other, of course. But really when we hang out, these are the conversations we're having all the time. And we've hung out with other people
similar
who find it hilarious that it's always a Bliss and Grit episode.
Slightly less dark humor on air than in private.
Way more dark humor and inside jokes related to television, just in case y'all are wondering how intensely spiritual we are. So it's been nourishing on all those fronts, as I expected and hoped it would be. And it's been nourishing to the people who listen. That we have discovered this funny kind of relationship with this large group of people, thousands of people who care to listen. And more than that, who feel impacted by it. That we're all in this funny little awakening pod together. And we hear all the time when we put out an episode, oh my God, get out of my head, right? Or how did you guys know? Or this is exactly what I needed to hear. And even if it's not the most recent episode, people will say, I just randomly went back and listened to episode, whatever the number is, and it was exactly what I needed to hear. So I can't really express how sweet that has been to feel like, for two people who were born to feel useful, it's really satisfying to feel like, wow, this is personally satisfying and then actually useful in the world. So of course it's something that we adore. And when you adore something, you just assume like, okay, it'll just continue as it is, as a weekly podcast. And then change arrives, meaning it just shows up. And in this case, and in many cases, it starts with its little movements and grumblings and rumblings and callings. And so we've been in a little bit of a process together, most overtly since summer, really, of sorting out like, okay, well, what's the shape? How do we make this work? And part of it comes down to practical details of we live in different places and we have full private practices and scheduling and tech and all of that stuff. And how do we make this work within the constraints that we have? And I think that was the question for both of us for a long time. How do we make this work, this thing that we love, within the constraints that we have? And we just kept sort of canoodling on that until it became clear, like, we just changed the constraints that we have. Like, we don't have to.
Whose constraints were they anyway?
Right, exactly. We don't have to put out an episode every single week if that means that it keeps us from whatever growing edges are happening for us personally, creatively, professionally. That we were trying to fit everything into the nest called Bliss and Grit. And it was like, there is a nest called Bliss and Grit. And like there are other callings too that can happen outside of that container.
Well, it gets especially intriguing, like I said in the intro, let's say, for example, you're in a relationship and that relationship has to end. You kind of feel it because it hurts. Mm-hmm. It's starting to hurt more than it feels good. And you're thinking, I've got to change this, but you're scared, but you just have to find that courage, find that capacity and make that motion. Well, that's one kind of change. And that's a very difficult process in and of itself. But it's interesting to go through change, which is more like leaving the nest.
Yeah, it's more confusing because it's like, well, why would I leave a nest?
Yes, we've been a great shelter for each other. You all have been a great shelter for us. I can't even believe we have 150 hours of us talking. I mean, my God, how much can someone talk, right? That's part of the issue, is we've overtalked ourselves, I think. But nevertheless, it's interesting because here's how it feels if I look in retrospect. Like, you just get a signal, and signal is a very broad word because maybe it's a sense, maybe it's a collection of thoughts, but you get a signal that's like, move this way. Mm-hmm. And you're like, no, but the nest.
Right.
No, but the nest. And so then, as you were saying earlier, Brooke, you're like, no, I'm going to make this work within the confines of the nest. Now, for all of you listening, you probably have your own version of this, or maybe you will have your own version of this, or maybe you fear this, where in a relationship or a job, or maybe you're in graduate school and there's something you love about it, or you treasure it, or you did value it in the past, or you honored it. But you're getting this nudge inside that's saying something else, move this way. And the crazy part is you don't even exactly know where you're moving to all of the time, right? You don't exactly know why, but you're getting this nudge. And that is just a really interesting thing, because you know what I started thinking about in retrospect, Brooke, is that it's like, if we didn't listen to the nudge inside of us, and if we didn't have the maturity we have to talk it through and be like a support and meta process and all of those good things that we do, it would have just gotten messy. In other words, like, this is just my idea. If we're meant to move in the next direction, take a little more time for ourselves, rest a little bit, create other projects. If you don't listen to the first nudge, what happens, right?
It all starts to get more compacted.
In retrospect, when I look at my life, it just got messier. Until I finally did. So it's really interesting to be at this particular junction where we could feel the nudge without a lot of mess occurring yet.
Yeah.
That makes sense to you?
Totally. And I remember when we still hadn't sort of resolved, like, well, what's the plan? Or what does the container look like? But we knew we were in process with something new. And I was doing Jane Clapp's course, From Fawn to Fierce. And there was a lesson in it about the pack, and the black sheep, the proverbial black sheep, right? And she was talking about how, our brains, because we're mammals, we're really designed to feel safe within a pack, within a community. And I'm sure if I actually, studied anthropology and sociology, I would understand that there's good reasons, of course, that back in earlier parts of the human species, to be ostracized or kicked out from the group would actually mean death, right? So bad times. So we're pretty hardwired from a survival point of view to not break away from the pack, to not leave the nest, because that's where it's safe. But we're living in different times where we get to do lots of things, but one of them is use our capacities in more creative ways. I have more safety than early Homo sapiens has in some regards, right? In the sense of, like, the heat is running in my house right now, and there's food in a thing called a refrigerator, and there's baseline ways that that's secure, so I can play with being more creative or following these impulses, thinking about the kinds of things we talk about on the show. But it really struck me in that course. I was like, those moments where you just have an epiphany land, like, we're the pack for each other. Like, it feels, there's a level at which, at that time when we were like, well, how do we funnel all of our ideas that each one of us might have individually into the thing called Bliss and Grit? And that was sort of what we were grappling with. Like, again, like, we just don't have to have that constraint. We can just take that off the table. But what does that mean? That means that in a certain regard, in a very safe regard, right, that we're each going to do things outside of that container. And that is that breaking away from the pack. And it's like, I really realized that there was this root survival safety need that had just gotten coded in there. Like, well, like, Vanessa and I were always in sync. We've been on this path together for so long, and we'll continue to be, because, we're just lifelong friends. And for whatever reason, just when we were catching up before the show, it's like, yes. And again, same epiphanies are landing at the same time. But that there was the nudge, kicked out of the nest, like, gotta go do the new thing now.
I know this may seem like an awful tangent, but it's so funny because I was thinking this last night, and here it is. Okay, I was watching a movie last night called Alpha. Did you ever see it?
Is that the animated one?
No, it's about this. It's supposed to be about the story of how the first wolf became domesticated to be a dog, right? To be a pet. It's a lovely movie. I mean, I don't know how much based in truth it is, but anyway, this guy gets lost from his tribe and he's out alone and he befriends this wounded wolf. But watching the movie and seeing this guy try to get through the elements alone, you realized you really couldn't do that. I mean, you couldn't face the animals alone. You couldn't even hunt alone. Like the way that they hunted involved this coordinated effort of having to kind of surround the animals. So all of those different things, it was wild to watch because, you know, a lot of times words just sound like ideas, right? They're words. Right. They sound like intellectual ideas. But when you talk about how the limbic brain is really coded as breaking away from the pack or interpersonal strife is a death threat, right? Is a threat to your survival. Yeah. It sounds as if like, oh, that's an interesting idea, but it shouldn't be that way. I should be more evolved than that. Or I don't know, it loses the intensity. But when I watched that movie, and it was just a movie, but they did a beautiful job with the graphics and showing what it might be like to be a man alone. As you were saying, in all the elements, like there's snow, he doesn't have enough clothing, he has no body heat with people. And I was like, wow, yes, that's really wild. So for all the codependents in the house and all the empaths who are like, I shouldn't care what anyone thinks. It's like, well, no, of course you do. Right. Yeah. And what we're hoping is just to evolve to a place where there's enough trust within and enough safety without that we can make creative leaps. Mm-hmm. Right. And that's really when I started on, I would say maybe just to put words on it, like the more awakening side of my journey, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, whenever we started Bliss and Grit, about 4 years ago, this was, I guess, I always remember one of my bigger fears was that I would go through an evolutionary process and I would lose Mario, my husband, if you're all just listening for the first time. And that's actually not an uncommon fear. I hear that echoed back to me through a lot of my clients. You know, I'm scared I'll go in this process and I'll lose my family. I'll lose my husband. I'll lose my wife. I'll lose my partner. What happens when you start to get a sense that if you go on a transformational journey, maybe that job that you're in won't work anymore, but you've become dependent on a certain income or, you know, there's so many things that can come up. And I think that that's just, what if something I love or I count on or I rely on or I honor goes away as a result of my transformation? And this case that we're sharing about ourselves personally, it's of the more minor accord, right? It's Brooke and I aren't losing each other. We're still going to be doing episodes whenever inspiration strikes. You know, we're still going to be in communication with all of you on social media. You'll find us. Like, we'll be there. We're still here. Brooke and Vanessa are still here. So it's quite minor, but at the same time, you can see all the different primal things that arise. Like, you want to label it, you want to give it reasons, you want to cling to it, you want to stay attached to it, you want to put, what were you saying before, Brooke, like a round peg in a square hole, right? Like,
just cram it right through that
cram it in
hole, yeah.
Make it work, right? Like all of these different things that can come up. And I do think it's interesting if we bring some attention in the conversation to how do we meet that on an internal level? I suppose both the fear that happens even before change comes your way, like you're just anticipating it and you're afraid. But then maybe more so what happens when that nudge comes, like, hey, this job's not working anymore, or, you know, it needs to change. It has to, you know, metamorphose into something new, or the relationship, it needs to change. Because of course, not everything requires walking away. Sometimes the change can exist within the structure. Brooke and I played with that, and we're not walking away, we're restructuring, but we played with it within the confines of the structure we had, and it just wasn't working. Not everything falls apart, but it is an interesting thing to look at, right? Like, how do we meet this on an internal level from a psychologically mature place?
Yeah, because ultimately what we're saying is that these whiffs of time for a change come along, and we're up against, in our case, we can take that off the table now, right? We're aware that we're talking about a very minor, very subtle thing. It's not connected to some of the larger nests that we have to leave in our lifetime. This is not what that is. But when it is one of the larger nests that we're in, and we're being nudged and getting informed in various ways that we're going to get kicked out of that nest. And so we'd better maybe start, percolating on what that might look like. There's not really much of a way around the fact that there's always going to be a leap of faith there. That leaving the nest has to be a leap of faith. And I don't mean that it has to be melodramatic or huge or instantaneous, but that ultimately, even if, and I would highly recommend that as much as is in our control, as much as we can do these things step by step and let our nervous system set some of the pace, because we're going to have to find that edge, right? It's not going to be super comfy. That's just the reality. Leaving a nest isn't going to be super comfy. So we're going to be up against our edge of discomfort, but we don't want to throw ourselves, onto the rocks either. So if we can incrementally reality test, even with our imaginations, other possibilities. I think sometimes we underestimate how wonderfully healing imagination is. And we forget that we're using our imagination all the time, but usually for ill. Usually our limbic brain is pumping out imagination scenarios of, well, what's the plan? What's going to happen if, or in the future, or going to the past, I shouldn't have, or that was so dumb. That's really just the imagination tormenting us, but we can harness its powers for good. And one of the ways that we can do that is to, if we're starting to feel nudges that there's a nest that we're getting nudged out of, can we start to use our imagination and not denigrate it in the way that our culture does? Oh, you're just imagining things. Can we use it to entertain possibilities, which is really different than magical thinking? So magical thinking is big. It's going to be big and important, and I'm going to move across to the other side of the world, or I'm going to completely change my field, or whatever. Entertaining possibilities has a lot more nuance and subtlety, and that we can let ourselves feel into, not just conceptualize, right? Because, oh my God, we can get so tired conceptualizing. If it's a career change, like, okay, I'm going to sit down and write down the 50 top careers for people in my age range, right? Like, we can make ourselves bananas. But to entertain the possibilities, I mean to feel into something of, well, what would I like if I'm getting nudged out of this nest? What would feel like a good other place to travel to? What would be another good nest that I would genuinely like? And that takes some slowing down and really feeling what we genuinely desire or are called towards. And it's funny because it's this combination of like using imagination for good and also looking at reality, right? Like, well, what's right here? What do I actually already know that I desire, but I just haven't slowed down enough to truly look at it?
Or I've been too scared. Mm-hmm. That could be as well.
Yeah. Look at. And I think scared moves fast. That's a part of why we can't slow down. Scared's like, get me to safe ground. What's the plan?
What's also fascinating is that sometimes you don't know where you're going to, and there is no answer. You just know move. And that gets really interesting. I mean, I remember as my first marriage ended, I loved him very much, even at the time. And it wasn't a pleasant time in our marriage by any means, but there was still a lot of value there. It wasn't as if I was like, oh my God, this is abusive, get me out of here. There was a lot of love, a lot of value, a lot of friendship. And yet I had seen the end of the road, but I had no idea what I was moving into, right? Yeah. It was just, this here is ending. And And that's a really interesting thing, and even with us, like you have a vision for your next project. I have inklings, but it's not like there was something else specific calling me. It's just
me.
Move this way, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like just move, right? That gets really interesting because, we've done episodes on basic trust. And depending on how ruptured your trust still is, how ruptured your faith still is, how your nervous system navigates change and what your capacity is, to move towards the unknown. I mean, that's always an interesting initiatory movement, if you will, like a rite of passage. I remember when my current husband Mario left his job in Wall Street, and he just was done with being in banking, but he had no idea of what was next. So that gets really interesting. And one thing I can say is like just to be able to hold the maturity of saying this is over without knowing, or this is over as it is in this particular form, because oftentimes it'll be like that, without knowing why. Sometimes you know why, sometimes you don't. Or knowing where you're going. Sometimes you do. Sometimes you're just afraid to admit it. Sometimes you don't. That's a really wild thing. And I think for a lot of people on evolutionary journeys, there is this kind of like rite of passage or this initiation into a relationship with the unknown that can be really wild.
I realize I'm about to mix many animal metaphors, or I feel like I've already brought in too many animal metaphors, but I keep thinking about this section of the book, The Art of Learning by Josh Waitzkin, that where he talked about, it's literally what it sounds like. It's explaining how to learn. How do you get good at learning? What does learning require? And full disclosure, for whatever it's worth, I used to work for his nonprofit to try and, disseminate the ideas in that. So I'm very familiar with the book. And there was a section talking about the hermit crab, that it's going to outgrow its shell. And there's going to be a period where it's like, it feels that it is too big for this shell and it needs a new shell. And there's this very, like, this is really true. This is very, very vulnerable moment on the ocean floor where it has to, like with all these predators around, it's got to get rid of the old shell and wander around this little gelatinous little guy to find a new shell that it does not already have, And that is the way this feels. Any of these changes are like, I know I can't stay here because I literally will die, right? I'm outgrowing my capacity to be in this home. So there's a risk. I have to leave behind the shell. And I know that's going to mean a really vulnerable stretch of walking. And I don't know how long it's going to take me to find the new shell. I don't know how it's going to go. But, the reason why I bring this metaphor forward is like the one thing we can say we know for sure is that that's really vulnerable. To be without the shell. And that if we can say that this metaphor applies, and I think it does when we are making a change, that we can at least hold it in tenderness for ourselves, right? If we can acknowledge, and because we're so hard on ourselves so often, right? Why don't I know what my next plan is? Or why can't I get it together? Or why does this feel like such a big deal? Or rushing ourselves, instead of feeling that way, reframing it and saying like, anytime we leave a nest, anytime we leave a shell, to mix my animal metaphors, it's going to be really vulnerable for a period of time. And it's a leap of faith because we don't know for how long, and we don't know what the new shell looks like. So it's a good time, in terms of brass tack strategies, it's a good time to double down on as much of our self-compassion work as we can muster, which is really different than the energy of like figuring it out or contorting ourselves to stay or rushing to create a new situation. it's really tender and slow and very nurturing.
Oh, yes. And depending on, what you're shifting and leaving, what is changing for you, there could be quite a push of energy involved, right? Like it can take quite a bit out of you to make that choice and to execute that choice. And what I have seen is we can underestimate how much rest we need, how much care we need. And I remember when I left my marriage, and I kind of did this big push. I knew that it was time to end things, as did he in his own way. And we're still good friends. So it was quite a friendly process in the end, but still a very hard one and a very emotional one. And what I did, Brooke, was a little bit like what you were describing earlier. I didn't know what this would mean for me relationally. I mean, at that age, I was scared I would never fall in love again. Though I hoped it would mean at some point a new relationship. But I did start to think, like, what am I not doing because I'm in this relationship? Like, is there anything I've been wanting that I have said no to because I'm here and I'm married and my life is interwoven with someone? And I got a very clear sense. I had wanted to move to the West Coast. I had wanted to go back to grad school. I wanted to study with John Wellwood. So I kind of did what you said. I used my imagination to say, well, what doors might have been closed to me because of I was committed into this direction with this one person in New York, et cetera. So I had something I was moving towards, which was wonderful. I mean, it's quite nice when you're leaving behind something that you treasure that's like kind of breaking your heart, not kind of breaking your heart to leave. In that case, it was literally heartbreaking. To have something else you were moving towards. It wasn't a replacement for him, but it was still very nice. But when I got to California, which is where I moved to go to grad school, I was exhausted. I mean, exhausted. I remember just the process of caring for myself, and maybe it's physiological, maybe it's your adrenal glands, like whatever it is. I remember having to take vitamins and just being very nurturing about the process. These kind of pushes, like when you're pulling yourself out of the nest, so to speak. And it depends on the emotions involved in that experience. It can be exhausting. And the one thing I would say that was interesting in retrospect from a psychological perspective was him and I had pretty much decided to have a conscious decoupling. Before that was kind of a big thing, but we wanted to try to remain respectful and remain friends at the end. And it was interesting to observe how much my survival system wanted to collapse things. Like, in other words, in order to tolerate the grief involved in making the change, in order to tolerate the faith involved in making the change, and all of these capacities that I was in some ways lacking and in some ways growing, I wanted to make him bad. I wanted to make the marriage bad. I wanted to, kind of make everything really black and white, like as if I didn't lose anything because he's the worst, or, we can paint our time like if you're in a job and you're leaving it behind, like it never worked. But maybe at some point it worked for what it worked for you, right? And now you're just a new you. And the new you is beckoning for another structure or another circumstance. So it was interesting to go through a process with some consciousness, like to observe what it's like to imagine the change. Like before you even make it, if you're getting the nudge, like just observe, when I imagine making it, what's that like for me? And then be with that, right? See what that is, unpack that, love that, meet that. And then as you're going to make the change, maybe what's, as you were saying before, Brooke, like the kindest way I can do it. The most intelligent and respectful way I can do it for myself and for others. And then it's as we're going through it, like how might I communicate it in a way that comes from my highest level, not my most degraded survival level. And then there's, once I've done it, how do I support myself and maybe others through the process? Sometimes others are involved, like if you're leaving a marriage, there are children. that are being impacted, or, there's many changes that involve multiple people as you make it. So there's like so many different phases, but I mean, that's, I suppose, what life's about, right? Transformation and change. It's the constant. So it behooves us, all of us, to become more loving and more thoughtful and slow down. And like, how will I as a human navigate this process of change that happens to me, and change where I have to follow my inner voice of wisdom and shift something, because it's just time. Maybe no other particular reason, or maybe there is, but.
Yeah. And we have to give ourselves permission to change. Like, I have seen so much, like this whole conversation that you and I have, and everyone who's listening to it, it's because they're on what we can loosely describe as some kind of path of transformation, right? Some kind of path of shifting consciousness and shifting the practical details of life, by which I mean the way life is experienced. And yet we often don't give ourselves permission to change. It's really funny. It's like we want to shift and change, but have all the structures, all the nests remain untouched, which is a really beautiful sentiment.
Yeah, we want to transform inside, but not rock the boat on an external level.
Right. No boats will be rocked in this transformation. It's just not true, and I have a ton of affection for where that comes from, and I've lived it a bajillion times, right? Like, I don't want to be kicked out of the nest, yet I want to be going through this internal process of coming to more and more clarity and more love, right?
And freedom.
And yet, but all this stays
but don't
the same.
Change this. Yeah.
And I understand the fear, yet we also have to give ourselves permission to harvest, right? Permission to get what we have actually been asking for and also engaging with, that we want to experience different aspects of ourselves and different potentials of ourselves and different aspects and potentials of the world, the life outside. I remember years ago working with a trauma therapist, and I think I've shared this on the show before, and she was saying that in her experience, what her clients had the hardest time with was how much clarity would come in, right? You heal trauma and you're so focused on sort of this purging of what you're there for. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh, like now I see my life with this really fresh clarity, and I see what I chose from this very sort of foggy, murky mind that is now no longer foggy or murky. And so I'm stuck with nests needing to be, I need to leave certain nests, and there are certain practical details of life that no longer fits. Maybe you had an abusive parent and then your abusive boss exactly mirrored that abusive parent. You heal a bunch of the trauma. Well, you're sure not going to tolerate the abusive boss. So, I have to go job hunting. And that is, we can have a lot of tenderness for ourselves, right? When we're harvesting the fruits of our transformative labor, so to speak, like there's going to be some stuff that we need to shift and play with. Change is going to arrive, and we're being asked to emerge into what life looks like on the other side. And I've used that as a mantra for myself several times, like permission to change. Identities don't want things to change because they exist in order to hold a certain perspective on safety in place. I will be safe if I fill in the blank.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then it's like, but the fill in the blank needs to go. Am I still safe? And this is our leap of faith moment.
It's interesting. I remember, I think it was Matt Kahn talking about the unknown and, the fears we have around the unknown. Because, of course, when we're afraid of change, we're afraid of the pain we'll go through as we're letting go of whatever, might be near and dear to us, if it is near and dear to us. But we're afraid of the emotions and the pain we'll go through in the process. And then we're afraid of the unknown. what will it be like once I do this? Who will I be? What will I meet? Like, how will this go for me? Right. And he was talking about the fear of the unknown. And he's like, you can't be afraid of something you don't know. Like, if you don't know it, you can't be afraid of it. What you're afraid of is everything you project into the unknown.
Yes. Imagination being used for ill.
Right. And what you project into the unknown is a lot about the ways you've been wounded, right? We'll project into that blank screen, ways we've been hurt, ways we've been harmed, our beliefs about ourselves and the world. So, for example, when I was first going through that divorce, I was younger, I was 33, and I dealt with feeling grossly unlovable for much of my life, well into my mid-30s. I mean, on some level, there's still levels I grapple with that, but not like that. I mean, I thought I was grossly unlovable well into my mid-30s. And when I was thinking about leaving my partner, which, the writing was on the wall for both of us, like we needed to make a movement, I would project into the unknown. Well, no one's ever going to love me again. I'm going to be alone forever, right? There'll never be anything else. Well, it's the unknown. Mm-hmm. I have no idea what's going to happen, right?
Infinite possibilities, right?
Infinite possibilities in the emptiness of the unknown. But what I was afraid of was exactly what I was healing, right? It was exactly the ways that my wounding had operated or my survival system had operated. So it's really, it makes the process, a challenging one because we believe our beliefs so well, right? So when my belief comes up, well, you're unlovable and that's why your marriage is ending. And so you'll probably never get another one. At the time when that was arising, it's like, well, that sounds true. I am firmly identified with the belief. I don't have that anymore. I have so much more space around my beliefs, but it was arising. And so then I'm projecting that into the unknown as if that's happening. Mm-hmm. So then, oh my God, of course I'm not going to leave.
Yeah.
Right. I'd rather try to keep fitting this square peg into a round hole because just maybe I'll get it in one day, with this person, than take a leap into a guaranteed unlovability status,
Right.
And of course I did leave and there was courage and I did find the capacity and it was a beautiful decision and the right one for both of us. But these kinds of transitions can be scary, one, because we fear the feelings that'll come up. So the more we've evolved the capacity to sit with our feelings and breathe and love ourselves and love them and soothe and find safety in the room and all of the different things we're always talking about on this show, the more we can do that, the less that registers as a factor. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, the second thing is whatever you predict will happen for yourself in the space of the unknown, that's a good place to consider doing some inner work.
Mm-hmm. That's a good pro tip. I really like that from Matt.
Sometimes it's circumstantial, fine. Like There are things you could predict. It's reality, but get curious about that.
It's a useful inquiry, right? It could be, because I'm talking about, we so often use our imagination for ill, right? So we can see how that can easily go into the dualistic thing of like, I'm using my imagination for bad job. Don't do that. How do I use my imagination for good? And then we just torture ourselves freshly. But if instead it's like, well, the unknown is perceived as scary and we use it as a mirror, right? So what am I looking at when I look at the unknown? I'll never be loved. I'll be alone forever. Interesting. So
I'm going to fail.
Right. Is that, in fact, the way I have always been wounded is that the pain that I'm up against is that the pain that actually, as you go through the transition, as you go through the transformation, is what is unraveling and melting away.
The very thing that's being invited to heal.
Right. Because you're reality testing. Like you're going to have the courage in your case to leave the marriage that isn't working. And, life it's always fun when we can zoom out and watch the screenplay of our life. It's not what it felt like in the moment. Right. But there is love, right? You're very happily married. There's been so much love.
I remember I learned that very quickly because he and I stayed friends. And it was not a pretty process. I mean, it involved many nights of us still fighting on the phone or me breaking down, crying, miserable or I don't know, whatever. But what was interesting is at that phase, I learned, oh my God, this person loves me. because there's nothing they're getting out of me. I'm not cooking for them, or I'm not, tending to their emotional needs or their sexual needs. Like, we're just having this really raw, not easy relational process. And he's not going anywhere. He's just as committed to it as I am. And I got the dawning realization, oh my God, I think he loves me. And then I thought, oh my God, I think he always loved me. Duh, he married me. And then I started to look and, people were in my periphery, and I started to realize, love was never the problem. I've always been loved. Mm-hmm. That was never the problem. And then I started to get closer to what the issue at hand were, the issues at hand were for me. But it was, just like you were saying, the very thing I was the most afraid of was the thing that I actually got a deeper healing around once I found the courage and capacity to listen to that inner voice and make the movement that was counter to what the fear was telling me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, usually our fear is what's healing. I like that very much. I'm going to sit with that.
I got a little offering the other day from a teacher, Lori Spagna. She was talking about fear, and I'm sure I'm not going to paraphrase this perfectly, but here's what was interesting. She was differentiating between, sometimes fear saying that's not aligned for you. Don't go that way. In other words, don't walk down that alley, or don't say that to that person. And there's plenty of times where fear is a signal. That's not for you. That's not intelligent. That's not your path. That's not aligned. Okay. Versus the fear that comes up when it is your path, when it is aligned, but there's the fear. And she was saying that one thing to consider is this fruitful? Like, behind this door of fear, is there something fruitful for me? Or is there just more fear to be born? So she was giving a very rudimentary example of it, but she said, let's say you're going to go on retreat and you're afraid. I don't want to spend this $2,000. Like, do I deserve it? But behind that door is this very fruitful experience of a retreat and you committing for yourself and investing in yourself. So, okay, that's one thing. But now imagine you think the same process, but you're 50 grand in debt already. Mm-hmm. Behind that is more debt, more fear, more. Well, that's the way of saying it's not for you. And that's like a very simplistic example, but it's really interesting because let's say in this case, Brooke, we may have some fear like, oh, a change is coming. What will this mean for us? But you could imagine behind this door, there's not more fear. Mm-hmm. There's possibility. There's personal evolution for each of us. There's professional evolution for each of us. There's professional evolution for Bliss and Grit as we remove the structures of what we're supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
Right? Like, there's all sorts of evolution. So yes, you may feel fear, but behind that choice, like right beyond that choice, it opens you up to potentiality and fruitfulness. And that's a way that you can differentiate between fantasy and a real invitation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's nice and clear. I like that very much.
Oh, good. I'm glad I said it in a way that was clear, because it's like I never articulated it out loud yet, and it's in my head as clear. Mm-hmm. But I'm like, does that sound clear on the outside? But so often, when we make movements, we're like, oh, I got a voice. I have to make a movement. I have to, move to Thailand. I have to quit my job,
Yeah.
And then we
start to get superstitious about anything. I saw a travel magazine with Thailand on the cover. I was just talking about that.
And we start to get this like, I have to move in that direction because we're talking about change. And then maybe you're getting these like twinges of fear or nervousness or anxiety. Like, really look at your life. Like, is it going to put you into bankruptcy? Like, right. Can you float this? Like, and I'm not trying to crush anyone's dreams, but really like getting closer to your own experience and saying like, where's this coming from? Mm-hmm. For us, at this point with this decision, because it was a fairly low stakes, even though it's emotionally invested, but no one's going to get harmed by our choice. Mm-hmm. We could see like, okay, this isn't fantasy. This isn't delusion. I mean, who knows? Maybe we'll find out there is. But
well, and we spent a bunch of time. Like, we took it slow, right?
Yeah, we did.
Let's feel into this.
We were very thoughtful and spacious about our process. But But that's just the little funny caveat on the other side of if you're like, I knew it. Brooke and Vanessa said, if you feel you got to move, move. And it's like, okay, but yes, if that's very genuine. But sometimes our survival systems can co-opt the fantasy mechanism and say, you have to do this.
Right.
And so remember to slow down and really check in, like behind this door, what is actually waiting for me? And that has to include the whole of your reality. Who's affected by this?
Yeah.
Who's on the other side? What's the financial impact, et cetera, et cetera. So just go slow and be real thoughtful with yourself. Yeah. And then I had a second point that just fell away. So irrelevant.
Well, I'll say what I was thinking, which is that sensation wise to me, because I'm so sensory, like when we're being invited to a change because it's here, right? Like time for something new to move in. It feels a little bit like being in a river with a current. And initially you're like digging in your heels, right? Or you're like treading water. You're like, nope, not sure about that, not sure of that. And then the leap of faith moment is like, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to float. I'm going to lay on my back and I'm going to see where this current takes me. And the other one has more of like a bunny hop quality, like hopping away real fast, real big, away from something.
Away from something.
Exactly. There's an away from, like, gotta get out of here, and boing. And that is more of that fear brain is like, here we go. Gonna jump over to this now. And, for me, it helps to feel into, am I hopping away from something? And there's this really rapid feeling about it, like, or is there the, like, I can feel the current has changed and I'm like, I don't know.
Yeah. One can have a real desperate quality and the other can have a like,
it's like,
oh boy, I feel it coming. Right. I remember what I was going to say. That was a great point, Brooke. And the other thing I was thinking is, the fear brain has a way of collapsing everything into binary. Mm-hmm. So when change comes, it's like, do I stay or do I go? Do I talk to this person or don't I? Do I, whatever. It collapses everything into binary. But really, what's beautiful when you slow down is to bring in a myriad of possibilities. So that's why we were saying earlier, in this case, like we went through all the different permutations and we're like, let's do it at the speed of inspiration. We think that'll be once a month. Maybe it'll be a little sooner, maybe a little later. Maybe we'll have teachers we love to interview and we'll speed it up, like speed of inspiration. But we went through a process, like kind of trying out all potentialities because I think when we're on the precipice of change, we just want to hurry up and do something, right? We want to kind of know what bucket we're going to be in so we can get really binary about it. But, sometimes it's not about leaving something behind. Sometimes it is about finding a new way to engage with something that's there for you, right? Sometimes it's about finding a new creative approach, or sometimes it's about healing. If there's disrespect and abuse, it's about leaving.
It's always about leaving.
It's about leaving. It's always about finding the support necessary if you can to leave. If that is an option, we do that. But outside of that, perhaps it's an invitation to heal something. So, please, we know the way the human mind works. When you listen, this isn't about running to change something. It's also not about blinding your eyes to the change that may be coming. It's about having, as always, an open, alive, curious, compassionate inquiry with yourself. What is this? What would this be like? What's happening for me? Is it an invitation to stay and heal? Oh, no, I really seem to be being asked to leave. Oh, where am I going? What's that like?
Perfect.
And maybe just a quick thing. So wrapping it up, I mean, I guess we have plenty of time. Oh, P.S., you guys, we're thinking the new year is when the change is going to institute for Bliss and Grit. And we'll keep in touch with you all about it. We're kind of like talking to you in process, but we're thinking speed of inspiration. That sounds about right, Brooke? Mm-hmm. Anything else to add about that? And that'll happen in 2020. We've got some new projects in the works from Brooke, right? Yes, still?
Yeah, I'm working on a course called Embodying Safety, which will be out early 2020, probably February.
Okay, so stay on the mailing list
talking about that. Yeah.
Yes. I don't know, but something's percolating. I think it'll be mystical. I think it'll involve in person, but I don't know. Isn't that
still
fun?
Still making itself.
It's still ripening, so we'll see, and it'll arrive at the speed of perfection. And so the other thing I would say is, please, if you're not subscribed to the podcast, subscribe. Also on YouTube, if you listen via YouTube, whatever way you listen, subscribe, because as of 2020, when it gets a little more irregular in frequency, it'll just download into your device, or it'll give you a notification, and then you'll know that we did something.
Perfect. Here come changes. Here we go.
Here we come.
Thank you so much for being a part of our community and for listening to today's show. The show notes, including any resources we mentioned, live at blissandgrit.com. That is also where you can subscribe to get our weekly digest of what we're up to and other resources that we're currently finding helpful. If you're wanting more support, blissandgrit.com also has more information on our private coaching practices. We're so grateful for the reviews you've written, for the membership support that so many of you have provided at Patreon, and for all the notes that you send. Thank you. We'll be back next week.